Picture yourself walking through the narrow, cobblestone streets of a medieval city. The air is thick with the scent of spices and salt. The sounds of haggling in a dozen different languages echo off stone walls. And everywhere you look, your eyes catch strange, intricate symbols carved into doorframes, scratched onto market stalls, even etched quietly into the corners of gravestones. To the untrained eye, they might look like random scratches or decorative flourishes, but to those who knew how to read them, these symbols formed a complete, sophisticated language, a silent, visual code that powered some of the most complex economic networks the world had ever seen. This was the hidden world of merchant marks, a forgotten system of communication that mapped the rise and fall of entire economies operating in the shadows of history. For centuries, merchants, bankers, and craftsmen across Europe and beyond used these personalized symbols not just as signatures, but as tools of trust, identity, and security. In an era before universal literacy, formal contracts, or international law, your mark was your reputation. It was your bond, carved on a crate of silk, stamped on a ledger, or pressed into the wax seal of a promissory note. These marks could tell a story of origin, quality, partnership, and creditworthiness. They were more than just marks, they were silent witnesses to deals made and broken, to fortunes built and lost, to alliances formed across cultures and conflicts. They formed the backbone of what we might call hidden economies, informal, trust-based networks that moved goods, money, and influence across continents, often operating just outside the reach of kings, churches, and guilds. In this video, we're going to unravel the secrets of this visual language and explore how it helped shape the economic landscape of the medieval world, and by extension, our modern global economy. We'll see how these symbols facilitated trade from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, how they built bridges between strangers who didn't share a common tongue, and how they documented moments of incredible expansion as well as devastating collapse. And perhaps most importantly, we'll discover what these ancient symbols can teach us about trust, innovation, and human resilience, lessons that feel just as urgent today as they did 600 years ago. So come with us on this journey into the past as we decode the stories hidden in plain sight and explore how a language of lines and curves helped write the economic history of half the world. Picture yourself standing on the docks of 12th century Venice. The harbor is a forest of masts, the air a cacophony of foreign tongues, Arabic, Greek, Latin, dialects from across Europe and the Mediterranean. Coins from a dozen different kingdoms change hands, but how do you, a merchant, prove ownership of a shipment of silk? How do you extend credit to a business partner you've never met, from a city you've never visited, when neither of you can read or write a common contract? This was the daily reality of medieval trade, a world buzzing with commercial energy but desperately lacking the tools we take for granted. Out of this chaotic, vibrant necessity, a brilliant solution was born: the merchant mark. These were not simple signatures, they were complex personal emblems, carefully designed and deeply meaningful. A typical mark might blend the initials of a merchant's name, woven into a unique geometric pattern, and often topped with a small cross or other religious symbol for divine protection. Think of them as a family crest, a corporate logo, and a notarized signature, all rolled into one elegant, instantly recognizable symbol. For an illiterate artisan, stamping his mark on a piece of pottery was his way of saying, "I made this and I stand by its quality." For a trader, carving that same mark onto a barrel of wine bound for a distant port was a promise of authenticity and a claim of ownership that could be understood from London to Alexandria. The design of each mark was far from random. It was a silent language packed with information. That cross inside a circle wasn't just decorative. For a Christian merchant sailing his goods into predominantly Muslim ports, it was a subtle signal to potential business partners: you can trust me. We share a belief in a higher power that holds me accountable. Other marks incorporated tools of the trade. A baker might use a stylized sheaf of wheat, a shipwright a simplified anchor. These symbols created a visual shorthand that bypassed language barriers entirely. A German merchant who spoke not a word of Italian could look at a bolt of cloth marked with a distinctive pair of shears and know immediately he was dealing with a reputable woolens maker from Florence. As these trade routes expanded, so did the use and importance of these marks. They evolved from simple ownership labels into the foundation of a vast, trust-based economic network. A merchant's mark became his most valuable asset, his reputation. That symbol guaranteed that the silver he promised was pure, that the debt he incurred would be honored. This system of silent, symbolic trust allowed goods and credits to flow across borders with a fluidity that was astonishing for the time. It was this very network of symbols, recognized and respected from bustling port cities to quiet market towns, that laid the invisible groundwork for the sophisticated and often hidden economies that would soon rise to power. But these marks were far more than just simple signatures or decorative flourishes. They operated with their own intricate internal logic, a kind of visual grammar that was understood across vast distances. Just as a sentence is built from nouns, verbs, and adjectives following specific rules, a merchant mark was constructed from a set of shared visual components, each carrying its own meaning. At the heart of almost every mark was a base symbol, a foundational geometric shape that served as the anchor for the entire design. A circle might represent unity, wholeness, or the cyclical nature of trade and trust. A square could denote stability, honesty, and a solid foundation, highly desirable traits for someone handling your money or goods. A triangle might point upward, perhaps indicating aspiration or a connection to the divine, often used by those seeking heavenly favor for their ventures. Upon this stable base, merchants would then layer additional elements that acted like adjectives, specifying their trade, their origins, or their personal history. A shipbuilder, for instance, wouldn't just use a simple circle. He would augment it with graceful, wave-like lines curving around the edge, instantly communicating his connection to the sea and shipbuilding. A wool merchant dealing in one of the period's most valuable commodities would often incorporate symbols reminiscent of his product, a cluster of tiny lines evoking a tuft of wool, or a pair of crossed blades representing the shears used to clip it from the sheep. A blacksmith might hammer a simple anvil shape into the center of his square, while a baker could crown his design with a stylized sheaf of wheat. This visual vocabulary allowed for an incredible depth of information to be conveyed in a single, glanceable emblem. What's truly fascinating is that this grammar wasn't universal. It had distinct regional dialects. If you were to compare marks from an Italian trading hub like Venice or Genoa with those from a Germanic city like Lübeck or Cologne, you'd notice a world of difference. Italian merchants often favored elaborate, almost flamboyant designs filled with curving flourishes, intricate knots, and decorative elements that reflected the Renaissance artistry flourishing around them. Their marks were statements of individuality and prosperity. In contrast, merchants from Germanic regions tended toward a more austere, angular simplicity. Their marks were built from straight lines, sharp angles, and stark geometric patterns, projecting a sense of efficiency, precision, and no-nonsense reliability. This regional variation meant that an experienced trader could often guess the general origin of a business partner just from the style of their mark, adding another layer of silent communication to every transaction. This structured yet diverse system, as noted by economic historians like Dr. Elena Rossi, created a perfect balance. It allowed each mark to be completely unique to an individual or a family, like a fingerprint, while still being instantly legible within the wider commercial community. It functioned with the same efficiency as a modern corporate logo. You don't need to read the word Nike to recognize the swoosh. Its shape alone conveys a world of meaning about brand, quality, and identity. A medieval merchant felt the same intuitive recognition when he saw the familiar, wave-encircled mark of a trusted Hanseatic shipwright on a newly arrived vessel. By meticulously decoding these patterns and tracking their appearances in ledgers, on cargo manifests, and carved into the very buildings of ancient ports, historians can now reconstruct entire supply chains. They can map out the journey of English wool, marked with a specific symbol as it traveled to a Flemish weaver, whose own mark then appeared on the finished cloth bound for an Italian banker. This intricate web of symbols didn't just underpin economic trust, it was the very framework upon which hidden economies were built, enabling a silent, efficient, and global conversation of commerce. In many ways, these intricate symbols were the medieval equivalent of the powerful brand logos we recognize instantly today. Think about it. When you see a particular swoosh on a pair of sneakers, you immediately associate it with athletic performance and a certain standard of quality. 1,000 years ago, a consumer in a bustling market faced a similar challenge. They couldn't read a label or an ingredients list, and the merchant hawking his wares might be a stranger from a city they'd never heard of. How could they be sure the olive oil wasn't watered down, or the English wool wasn't some inferior local imitation? The answer was stamped right on the container or woven into the fabric's edge, the merchant's mark. That unique symbol was a silent guarantee. It told the buyer, this product comes from a known source. It has a reputation to uphold. You can trust it. This built incredible consumer loyalty across astonishing distances. A wealthy household in Paris might specifically seek out wine barrels bearing the distinct mark of a vineyard owner from Tuscany, having learned through experience that his vintage was consistently excellent. That mark created a direct personal connection between producer and consumer, spanning hundreds of miles and numerous intermediaries. This trust had a very direct and powerful economic impact. It allowed merchants to charge more. Historical records from guild halls and port ledgers show that goods bearing certain well-respected marks could command premium prices, sometimes significantly higher than unmarked or generically marked items. A bolt of fine Flemish cloth stamped with the mark of a renowned master weaver was a known quantity, a safe investment. Its value was understood from Bruges to Constantinople. This premium wasn't just for luxury goods either. Even everyday items like pewter tableware plates, cups, and spoons were valued based on the mark they carried. But this very power of the mark, its ability to create tangible economic value, also created a powerful incentive for fraud. Unscrupulous traders would copy or mimic the marks of successful artisans to pawn off their own shoddy goods, pocketing the higher profits while damaging the hard-won reputation of the original maker. This led to some of the earliest recorded cases of brand protection and trademark litigation. The guilds, which functioned as a combination of trade union, regulatory body, and quality control agency, took this threat extremely seriously. In 14th century England, for example, the Pewterers' Guild maintained a formal register of its members' unique marks. Any new master entering the trade had to present his proposed symbol for approval, ensuring it didn't conflict with any existing design. If a merchant was caught using a counterfeit mark or falsely applying a respected guildsman's symbol to inferior products, the punishments were severe. They faced hefty fines, public shaming, the confiscation of their fraudulent goods, and could even be expelled from the guild entirely, an economic death sentence that barred them from practicing their trade legally in that city. This rigorous enforcement was crucial. It wasn't just about protecting one individual's business. It was about safeguarding the collective reputation of the entire trade and the trust-based system that allowed commerce to function. By drastically reducing what economists call transaction costs, the time, effort, and risk involved in verifying quality and ensuring a fair deal, this system of symbolic branding allowed medieval economies to scale in ways that would have otherwise been impossible. A merchant didn't need to personally know every single supplier. He could rely on the mark. This efficiency enabled the growth of vast, hidden trade networks that operated with a remarkable degree of autonomy, often weaving around official taxes, guild restrictions, and royal decrees. The mark was the key that unlocked these shadow economies, a tool of trust that empowered merchants to build complex, far-flung commercial empires based on nothing more than the power of a symbol. But this system of trust and public branding had a shadowy twin, a parallel economy that operated just outside the glow of the guild hall's lanterns. Beyond the regulated markets and official toll roads thrived what historians call the hidden economies, a vast, intricate web of trade that deliberately operated outside the reach of kings, churches, and guilds. These weren't just simple black markets, though they certainly included the trade in embargoed or forbidden goods. They were entire informal networks that filled the critical gaps left by the rigid, often cumbersome structures of feudal society. Imagine a world where a king, to punish a rival city, might suddenly ban all trade in English wool. Overnight, a commodity essential to thousands of weavers becomes illegal. But the demand doesn't vanish, it simply goes underground. This is where the hidden economies flourished, and merchant marks became their essential, clandestine language. These networks took many forms. There were the obvious black markets dealing in goods specifically prohibited by royal decree or ecclesiastical law, luxury silks from the East during a trade war, weapons sold to both sides of a conflict, or salt smuggled to avoid devastating government monopolies. Then there were the informal credit systems, often run by Jewish or Lombard bankers who were frequently excluded from the formal banking privileges granted to Christian merchants. They provided loans and moved money outside the official channels, using their own trusted marks to secure these off-the-books transactions. Perhaps most extensive were the clandestine trade routes, entire networks of paths, rivers, and coastal inlets used to bypass official toll stations and customs houses. A merchant could save a fortune by moving his goods a few miles out of the way to avoid paying a duke's heavy tariff, and that risk was often worth taking. In this shadowy world, the merchant mark transformed from a public badge of quality into a covert signal, a discreet handshake between those in the know. A symbol carved not proudly on a market stall, but subtly on the doorframe of a seemingly ordinary inn, might indicate to traveling merchants that the cellar within was a safe storage point for smuggled spices. A specific mark scratched onto a ledger next to a sum of money could denote a loan that would never appear on any official record, its repayment guaranteed only by the trust in that symbol. These marks allowed participants in these hidden economies to recognize allies, verify identities without drawing attention, and communicate safely under the noses of authorities. They were the cryptographic keys to a world of trade that official records pretended didn't exist. It's crucial to understand that these hidden economies weren't merely about illegality or rebellion. Often they were a necessary adaptation, a source of incredible innovation and resilience. When famine struck a region and grain prices skyrocketed, guilds might try to enforce old price caps, creating artificial shortages. It was frequently the hidden networks that moved grain from areas of plenty to areas of need, easing the crisis. When a plague wiped out a town's skilled craftsmen, it was informal apprentices trained outside the guild's strict 7-year system who helped rebuild the local economy. These shadow systems provided flexibility and fluidity that the top-down, rigid feudal order could not. By meticulously studying the sudden appearance, unusual clustering, or mysterious disappearance of specific merchant marks in archaeological digs, on discarded wax seals, hidden cellar walls, or personal belongings, historians can now map the startling rise and fall of these networks. They can see how a particular symbol associated with a family of Lombard bankers suddenly proliferates in port city records during a period of royal bankruptcy, suggesting they were filling a critical credit gap. Or how marks from a specific region vanish from official customs rolls only to appear more frequently on artifacts found along remote river routes, painting a clear picture of a thriving smuggling operation. This shadow world of trade, silently mapped by these symbols, didn't just run parallel to the official economy. It constantly interacted with and shaped it, setting the stage for periods of remarkable growth as well as devastating, system-wide collapses. This silent language of symbols didn't just facilitate individual transactions. It powered one of the most profound economic transformations in human history, an era scholars call the Commercial Revolution. For 3 centuries, from the 11th to the 14th, trade didn't just grow. It exploded, fundamentally reshaping European society, and merchant marks were the indispensable fuel for this explosion. In a world still defined by local feudal loyalties and a dizzying patchwork of laws and languages, these simple designs provided a universal framework for trust that allowed commerce to leap across previously impossible distances. A merchant from the rainy ports of England could now form a reliable partnership with a silk importer in sun-baked Sicily. They didn't need to speak the same language or navigate each other's complex legal systems. They only needed to agree on a shared symbol, a mark that would represent their mutual bond and guarantee their mutual profit. Consider the sheer logistical miracle this enabled. A merchant in the bustling Italian Republic of Genoa could assemble a shipment of fine Lombard wool, carefully marking each crate with a symbol known to his business partner hundreds of miles away in Constantinople. He would then entrust this valuable cargo to a ship's captain he might never meet again, sailing across a sea fraught with pirates and storms. There were no tracking numbers, no insurance documents in triplicate, no international courts to appeal to if something went wrong. The entire transaction rested on the power of that single mark. When the ship docked in the Byzantine capital, the recipient would see the familiar symbol and immediately accept the goods, knowing that his reputation and all his future business depended on honoring the implicit agreement. This system of symbolic trust drastically reduced the friction and cost of long-distance trade. It eliminated the need for armies of lawyers, reams of paperwork, or the physical transportation of heavy coinage for every deal. Capital and goods could now flow with a speed and freedom that was utterly unprecedented. The effects of this fluidity were revolutionary, quite literally changing the landscape of Europe. Wealth began to concentrate not in rural castles and feudal estates, but in vibrant, growing cities that thrived on this trade. Ports like Venice, Bruges, and Lübeck swelled in size and importance. Their skylines soon dominated not by church spires but by the impressive guild halls and warehouses of a newly powerful merchant class. These urban entrepreneurs, their status built on commercial success rather than inherited noble blood, began to challenge the very foundations of the feudal hierarchy. Their wealth gave them political power, leading to the rise of independent city-states and a gradual shift away from a land-based economy to one driven by commerce and capital. This was the birth of a new world, and it was all made possible by a network of trust woven together with symbolic thread. We can see the physical evidence of this network today. Archaeologists excavating medieval port cities have made a fascinating discovery. Clusters of the exact same merchant mark appear again and again, carved into the stone walls of cellars used for storage, etched into the beams of old market halls, and even scratched into the clay of discarded pottery. These aren't random collections of different symbols, they are repeated sets of identical marks. This tells a powerful story. It indicates that individual merchants weren't working alone. They were banding together into powerful consortia, early versions of what we would now recognize as multinational corporations. By pooling their resources and standardizing their marks, these groups could dominate entire trade routes, controlling the flow of goods from source to market, and leveraging their collective reputation to secure better deals and greater influence. Their shared symbol became a brand of immense power, a guarantee of quality and scale that no single trader could ever hope to achieve independently. This era of breathtaking expansion shows us that economies aren't built on gold and silver alone, but on something far more powerful and intangible, a shared language of trust. And as this system grew more complex, it would soon give rise to one of the most impressive economic empires of the medieval world. Nowhere was the power of this symbolic language more clearly demonstrated than in the rise of the Hanseatic League, a sprawling confederation of merchant guilds that came to dominate trade across northern Europe for nearly 4 centuries. Imagine a network of nearly 200 towns and cities, stretching from London in the west to the distant Russian outpost of Novgorod in the east, all bound together not by a common government or a powerful army, but by a shared commercial interest and, crucially, a shared system of symbols. This was not a traditional empire with a king and borders. It was an economic superpower built on trust, and its currency was the merchant mark. The League's heart beat in the German city of Lübeck, but its lifeblood was the flow of goods: Norwegian timber, Russian furs, English wool, Flemish cloth, all moving along sea and river routes under the protection of the Hanseatic name. To coordinate this vast, decentralized operation across different languages, laws, and currencies, the League developed a sophisticated and standardized symbolic language that acted as its glue. Hanseatic merchants adopted a system of marks that served multiple critical functions at once. First and foremost, these symbols were a clear badge of membership. A distinct mark, often incorporating elements like the League's iconic cog ship or a simplified version of a city's emblem, instantly identified a trader as part of the Hanseatic network. This membership came with immense privilege. In a foreign port like London's Steel Yard, the main Hanseatic trading base in England, seeing that familiar mark on a ship's manifest or a cargo crate meant immediate access. The goods were exempt from certain tedious customs inspections, eligible for preferential storage rates, and most importantly, they were granted instant credibility. That same mark also functioned as a rigorous quality seal. The League enforced strict standards on the goods traded under its banner. A bundle of fur pelts stamped with the approved Hanseatic mark wasn't just any fur. It was guaranteed to be of a certain size, quality, and preparation, inspected and approved by League officials. This allowed a buyer in Bruges to purchase fur from a merchant in Novgorod with absolute confidence, sight unseen. The mark had eliminated the risk. this system of symbolic trust created what was essentially a hidden economy of mutual support that operated with stunning efficiency. A Hanseatic merchant from Cologne could extend credit to a partner in Riga based solely on the recognition of their shared league affiliation, symbolized by their marks. Debts and payments were tracked through ledgers annotated with these symbols, creating a seamless financial network that often bypassed local banks and rulers entirely. The marks were engraved on official seals to authenticate documents, pressed into the wax seals on letters of credit, and branded onto the goods themselves. They transformed the League from a loose alliance into a cohesive and powerful brand. A barrel of salted herring bearing the Hanseatic mark didn't just contain fish. It carried the full weight and reputation of the entire commercial confederation, allowing it to command a higher price and find a ready market anywhere from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. This powerful brand loyalty, built on centuries of consistent quality enforced by their symbolic system, allowed the Hanseatic League to negotiate favorable treaties, defeat military rivals through economic blockades, and function as a de facto sovereign power, all without ever raising a royal standard or crowning an emperor. Their empire was built on trust, and that trust was communicated through a silent, universal language of lines and curves. While the bustling markets of the Hanseatic League demonstrated the power of merchant marks in the trade of physical goods, a parallel and perhaps even more revolutionary transformation was taking place in the world of finance, centered in the powerful city-states of Italy. Here, the very concept of money was being reinvented, and the humble merchant mark evolved from a symbol of ownership into a sophisticated cryptographic key for the world's first international banking systems. In an age where moving vast quantities of gold and silver coinage was slow, dangerous, and impractical, these symbols became the engine of a new, abstract economy, one built not on precious metal, but on trust and verification. The great Italian banking families, names like the Medici, the Bardi, and the Peruzzi, were the architects of this new system. Their operations stretched from Florence to London, from Constantinople to Bruges, and managing this financial empire required a way to move value across continents without literally shipping chests of coin. Their ingenious solution was the bill of exchange, a kind of medieval check. But for this system to work, the document itself had to be utterly trustworthy and impossible to forge. This is where the personalized merchant mark became indispensable. Each banking house had its own distinct, highly complex symbol that served as its unique signature. This mark was meticulously engraved onto their metal seals and pressed into the wax, authenticating every bill of exchange, letter of credit, and account ledger. It wasn't just a logo, it was a secure identifier, a tamper-proof guarantee that the document was legitimate. Imagine a Flemish wool merchant who has just sold a large shipment to a buyer in Florence. Instead of accepting a heavy, vulnerable sack of gold florins, he takes a bill of exchange from the buyer's Medici banker. This piece of parchment, stamped with the distinctive Medici pal marker, a set of 6 balls on a shield, is now his money. He could then travel back to his home in Bruges and present that same bill to the local Medici branch office. The agent there would examine the mark with expert eyes, checking the precise number of balls, their arrangement, the specific flourishes in the design. Once satisfied of its authenticity, he would pay the merchant the agreed sum in local currency, all minus a small fee for the service. No gold had crossed the Alps. The entire transaction was conducted on faith, secured by the power of that single symbol. This system allowed capital to flow with a speed and flexibility that was previously unimaginable, fueling everything from the wool and spice trades to the ambitious voyages of explorers seeking new routes to the Indies. Behind the scenes, these marks also created a complex web of accounting that functioned as a hidden economy of debt and risk. the banks used their marks in intricate ledgers to track a dizzying network of deposits, loans, and outstanding bills across their international branches. A mark next to a name didn't just identify the account holder. It could denote the terms of credit, the interest due, or the branch of origin. This system was a double-edged sword. It provided incredible liquidity and fostered economic growth on an unprecedented scale. But it also built a fragile house of cards where the default of a single major debtor, like a king refusing to repay a war loan, could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. The collapse of the great Bardi and Peruzzi banks in the 1300s was a stark reminder of this vulnerability, a financial crash caused by overextended credit, all meticulously recorded and ultimately doomed by the very trust those merchant marks had created. The marks themselves, pressed into the wax of now defaulted loans, became literal and figurative scars on the parchment of history, silent witnesses to the fact that even the most advanced symbolic systems could not fully insulate the economy from the perils of ambition and risk. But the story told by these symbols wasn't just one of unity and trust. It was also a story of power, status, and a rigid social order. If you knew how to read them, merchant marks were a clear public display of a person's place in the complex hierarchy of medieval society. The design of a mark wasn't just about personal taste. It was a carefully coded signal of class, wealth, and influence. A wealthy patrician merchant whose family might have intermarried with the local nobility and who sat on the city council would never use a simple, straightforward mark. His symbol would be an elaborate, almost heraldic emblem, filled with intricate scrollwork, complex geometric patterns, and motifs borrowed from aristocratic coats of arms. It might feature a lion for courage, an eagle for far-reaching vision, or a castle tower for stability and strength. This wasn't just a signature, it was a statement. It announced to the world that this was a man of substance, a man whose word was backed by generations of wealth and political connection. His mark was his passport to the most exclusive trading partnerships and the largest lines of credit, opening doors that remained firmly closed to others. On the other end of the spectrum, the mark of a humble journeyman weaver or a small-scale potter was a world apart. His symbol was often a collection of simple, practical lines, a straightforward cross, a basic circle with a single vertical stroke, or a simple combination of his initials rendered in an unadorned geometric shape. There were no flourishes, no decorative elements, and certainly no heraldic beasts. This simplicity wasn't a choice, it was a reflection of his station. A complex, elaborate mark for a low-ranking artisan would have been seen as presumptuous, even offensive, to the guild masters and wealthy merchants who controlled access to the best markets and materials. His simple mark did its job, it identified his work, but it also silently reinforced his place at the bottom of the economic ladder. This visual codification of class wasn't left to chance. In many cities, the powerful guilds actively enforced these distinctions as a way to maintain both quality control and social order. They created formal, hierarchical systems of marks that made a person's rank immediately visible. For instance, a master craftsman who had proven his skill, paid his fees, and been accepted into the full membership of the guild was permitted to use a specific, more complex version of his mark. His symbol might be allowed to include a special element, like a small crown or star, denoting his elevated status. An apprentice, still in training and living under his master's roof, would be required to use a much more basic, often provisional mark, if he was allowed to use one at all. And a journeyman, a skilled worker who had finished his apprenticeship but had not yet become a master, would use a mark that was recognizably his own, but without the prestigious additions reserved for the elite. This system ensured that anyone handling a piece of goods, from a customs official to a retail buyer, could instantly gauge the status of its creator just by glancing at the symbol. It was a brilliant, if ruthless, method of quality assurance. A master's mark carried an implicit guarantee of excellence, while a simpler mark set lower expectations. The implications of this went far beyond the cosmetic. The mark you used directly influenced your economic destiny. A powerful, elaborate mark acted like a modern-day credit score, granting its owner access to better loans, preferred suppliers, and high-value customers. A merchant with a renowned symbol could secure a large consignment of goods on credit alone, his mark serving as the only collateral needed. In contrast, a craftsman with a simple, low-status mark would be confined to local markets, forced to deal in smaller quantities, and would need to pay for materials upfront with hard currency. This system effectively embedded economic inequality into the very tools of trade, making it incredibly difficult for someone from a humble background to rise through the ranks. Your mark could trap you as easily as it could liberate you. Yet, the archaeological record shows us that this rigid system wasn't entirely frozen. During periods of tremendous economic boom, like the commercial expansion of the 13th century, we see fascinating shifts. Historians analyzing marks from this era have noticed a proliferation of newly complex symbols appearing alongside the established elite marks. These new designs often blend traditional elements with fresh, ambitious motifs. This is the silent archaeological signature of social mobility, the rise of the nouveau rich. A successful merchant from a modest family, having amassed a fortune through shrewd trade, would commission a new, more elaborate mark to reflect his changed status. He was literally rewriting his identity, using the language of symbols to claim a place among the powerful. This tension between the old money and the new, between entrenched privilege and ambitious talent, was quietly etched into every transaction, a constant undercurrent of social struggle within the economic boom. It serves as a powerful reminder that these networks of trust and trade were never neutral, impartial systems. They were human creations, deeply woven with the same biases, aspirations, and conflicts that defined every other aspect of medieval life, carrying within them the seeds of both incredible growth and future instability. While the rigid hierarchies of guilds and merchant classes often painted a picture of an exclusive male-dominated Christian economy, the reality, quietly etched into countless artifacts, tells a far more diverse and ingenious story. The world of medieval trade was not a walled garden. It was a sprawling, messy ecosystem, and those formerly excluded from its power centers found remarkable ways to cultivate their own plots within it. For women, Jewish traders, and foreign merchants, the merchant mark became more than a tool of commerce. It was a key to a back door, a way to claim an economic identity in a world that often refused to grant them one officially. Consider the experience of a Jewish merchant living in 13th century Spain, a place of tense but vibrant coexistence between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Legally restricted from joining Christian guilds and often subject to heavy taxes and social suspicion, Jewish traders nonetheless formed the backbone of certain long-distance networks, particularly in luxury goods, money lending, and medicine. How did they navigate this precarious landscape? They developed their own distinct visual language. Their merchant marks frequently blended the universal grammar of geometric shapes with a deeply personal element, Hebrew characters. A symbol might anchor itself with a circle or square, but weaving through it would be the elegant, angular letters of the Hebrew alphabet, perhaps spelling an abbreviation of the merchant's name or a meaningful word like chai for life or emet for truth. This created a powerful dual-purpose tool. To a Christian business partner, the geometric base signaled a recognizable, trustworthy commercial entity. To a fellow Jewish trader, the Hebrew letters confirmed a shared identity and community trust, a silent handshake that facilitated trade across vast distances from the markets of Cairo to the ports of Genoa. This was a brilliant adaptation, using the common language of trade symbols to build a parallel, resilient economy that operated within and around the constraints of official society. Women, particularly widows, employed a different but equally clever strategy. Formal guild membership was almost universally closed to them, but death could create a sudden and unexpected economic opening. When a master craftsman or merchant died, his widow often faced a dire choice: surrender the family business and its assets to the guild or find a way to keep it running. Many chose the latter, and the merchant mark was their lifeline. A widow would frequently continue to use her late husband's well-established mark exactly as it was. This was a pragmatic decision. That symbol held decades of accumulated goodwill, creditworthiness, and market recognition. To change it would be to start from scratch. In the eyes of the law and her business partners, she was essentially acting as a custodian for that mark's reputation, a reputation built by a man but now stewarded by a woman. In other cases, we see evidence of subtle adaptation. A widow might take her husband's mark and add a small, distinctive flourish, an extra line, a minor curve, a tiny star, creating a hybrid symbol. This allowed her to benefit from the existing reputation while quietly signaling a new chapter of ownership. Through these marks, we can trace the stories of women who were anything than passive inheritors. They were savvy business operators who leveraged the symbolic capital of the past to secure their own economic future. The survival of these marks on contracts, seals, and personal items is a gift to historians, offering fleeting but precious glimpses into the lives of economic actors who are largely absent from the official record. Their stories reveal a profound truth about the medieval economy, where formal structures created barriers, informal systems of trust, built on recognizable symbols, provided a workaround. The merchant mark was a great equalizer in this shadow economy. It didn't care about the gender or faith of the hand that carved it, only the reputation for honesty and quality that it represented. This symbolic language became a powerful tool of subversion, enabling marginalized groups to carve out spaces of autonomy and prosperity. Yet, this very tool of empowerment carried a terrible risk. In times of peace and prosperity, a distinctive mark could be a source of pride and profit. But during economic crises, a famine, a plague, a trade war, that same visibility could become a deadly liability. When scapegoats were needed for societal ills, the unique marks of Jewish merchants made them and their assets easy to identify and target. The records of a widow successfully running a business could attract unwanted attention from guilds eager to reclaim a master's privileges for a male member. The symbol that had been their shield could, in an instant, become a target on their backs. This double-edged nature of the mark reminds us that the hidden economies, for all their innovation and resilience, existed in a precarious balance, always vulnerable to the tides of fear and intolerance that could sweep through the medieval world. But the power of these symbols didn't just lie in their design. It was also a story of how they were made, the very physical process of stamping a reputation into existence. Creating a merchant mark was a deliberate and skilled act, and the tools used evolved from simple, hand-held implements into sophisticated devices that mirrored the growing complexity of trade itself. For the humble artisan working in his small workshop, the process might begin with a simple chisel and a mallet. He would carefully carve his chosen symbol into a wooden handle or a small metal die, a process that required a steady hand and a clear vision. This negative image could then be pressed into soft clay on a finished pot, or hammered onto a leather tag attached to a bolt of cloth. It was a personal, almost intimate form of branding, each application a direct physical connection between the maker and his work. For documents and more formal agreements, the tool of choice was often a seal press. A merchant would have his mark intricately engraved onto the face of a metal seal matrix, usually made of brass or even silver for the wealthy. This matrix would be pressed into a dollop of warm wax, leaving a raised, detailed impression of the symbol. This wax seal was more than just a signature, it was a tamper-evident security device. Breaking the wax to read the document inside would destroy the seal, providing a clear indication that the agreement had been interfered with. The very act of creating the mark was an investment in trust, a physical promise made manifest in wood, metal, and wax. The most personal and powerful tool in a merchant's arsenal, however, was arguably the seal ring. Worn on the finger, this was a symbol of identity that was literally always at hand. Crafted from precious metals and often set with engraved gemstones like hematite or carnelian, these rings contained a miniature version of the merchant's mark. With a quick press into wax, he could authenticate a letter of credit, sign a bill of lading, or seal a private correspondence. The convenience was revolutionary. A merchant no longer needed to carry a bulky seal matrix in his luggage. His authority traveled with him on his finger. This portability sped up transactions immensely, allowing deals to be closed on the spot in a bustling marketplace or on the docks of a foreign port. It also added a layer of security, as a personalized ring was far harder to lose or steal than a loose tool. The widespread adoption of seal rings represented a major technological leap, moving the merchant mark from the workshop into the dynamic, fast-paced world of mobile commerce. It empowered individual traders to act with unprecedented speed and autonomy, further fueling the growth of the hidden economies that thrived on quick, discrete agreements. Perhaps the most crucial aspect of all these early tools was the remarkable durability of the marks they produced. A symbol chiseled into the stone lintel of a warehouse, pressed into the wax sealing a legal document, or inked onto a parchment ledger wasn't meant to be temporary. These were intended as permanent records, and that permanence is what provides us with such a rich archive today. Centuries later, archaeologists can find those very stone carvings still in place, telling us who stored their goods where. Historians poring over ancient court records can find the original wax seals still attached, the impression of the mark still clear, allowing them to identify the parties involved in a contract from the 1300s. This physical endurance means that these silent symbols have survived fires, wars, and the simple ravages of time, offering us a direct, tangible connection to the economic lives of people long gone. We aren't just reading about their transactions in a history book, we are looking at the very marks they used to authorize them. This durability transformed the merchant mark from a simple tool of commerce into a time capsule, preserving the intricate web of trust and trade for future generations to decode. The next great technological shift arrived in the 15th century with two interconnected innovations: the widespread adoption of paper and the invention of the printing press. Paper, far cheaper and more readily available than precious parchment, meant that merchants and guilds could keep more detailed and extensive records. They could create multiple copies of contracts and manifests, and they could now print their marks using ink. A merchant could have a wooden or metal block carved with his symbol and use it to stamp his mark onto paper documents quickly and consistently. This was a move towards mass production and standardization. The printing press took this a step further, allowing for the precise reproduction of intricate marks in guild record books, printed manuals of approved symbols, and even early advertisements. This wide dissemination helped standardize the appearance of marks within certain trades and regions, making them even more universally recognizable. The technology that made information more accessible also made the language of commerce more consistent and far-reaching. Yet, as with so many technological advances, this new ease of reproduction came with a dangerous downside: the threat of mass counterfeiting. If a mark could be perfectly reproduced with a carved block and some ink, what was to stop a dishonest trader from simply copying the symbol of a successful rival? The very technology that helped standardize and spread the system of trust also made it more vulnerable. Guilds now faced a new kind of fraudster, one who could produce convincing forgeries not just on a few items, but on a potentially industrial scale. This forced a technological arms race. Merchants and guilds began designing increasingly complex marks filled with tiny, intricate details that were difficult to carve accurately without expert skill. They started incorporating hidden elements like minute dots or specific curves that only they knew to look for. The system of trust was evolving, moving from a simple matter of recognition to a more sophisticated game of authentication, where knowing how to spot a real mark from a fake became a critical business skill. This interplay between technological innovation and the constant need for security set the stage for an ever more complex economic world, one where the symbols of trust had to constantly evolve to stay one step ahead of those who sought to break it. We can actually see these moments of peak prosperity frozen in time, not through written economic reports, but through the silent explosion of unique merchant marks. Think of it like a geologist reading the rings of a tree to understand seasons of great growth. Historians can analyze the density and diversity of these symbols in specific places and times to pinpoint true economic golden ages. Take 13th century Flanders, for instance. This region was the absolute powerhouse of the medieval cloth industry, transforming raw English wool into the finest textiles that were coveted from Paris to Constantinople. And the archaeological record screams this success. Excavations in cities like Bruges and Ghent reveal a staggering abundance of distinct merchant marks from this era. They are carved into the stone of wealthy merchants' homes, stamped on countless cloth seals attached to finished bolts of fabric, and meticulously recorded in guild ledgers. This incredible proliferation isn't just a list of names, it's a map of a booming economy, showing a huge number of individual actors all thriving within a single, dominant industry. Each new, unique mark represents another successful business, another family fortune being made, another node in a vast and incredibly profitable network. The same pattern emerges if we sail south to the Venetian archives. During the height of the Serenissimo's maritime empire, when its galleys controlled trade routes throughout the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea, the volume of documented marks reaches a fever pitch. The state archives are overflowing with notarial records, cargo manifests, and contracts from the 14th and 15th centuries, every one of them authenticated by a unique merchant seal. This wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork, it was the lifeblood of an economic empire. The sheer number of marks tells a story of immense commercial activity, with thousands of merchants, both great and small, all participating in a system that generated almost unimaginable wealth. By meticulously cataloging these symbols across time, researchers can literally graph the city's economic fortunes, watching the line climb steeply upward as Venice cemented its power and then, as we will later see, begin to falter and decline. But these maps of commerce reveal something far more beautiful and complex than just numbers and trade routes. They show us a vibrant canvas of cultural exchange. In an age often simplified by tales of religious conflict and closed worlds, the merchant marks tell a different story, one of practical collaboration and artistic borrowing. A Christian merchant based in Alexandria trading with Muslim partners might incorporate a subtle geometric pattern, inspired by Islamic art, into the border of his own cross-topped mark. It was a silent signal of respect and cultural fluency, a way of building bridges and saying, "I understand your world, and you can trust me in it." Similarly, a Venetian trader dealing in spices and silks from the Far East might adopt a stylized dragon or a lotus flower motif into his family symbol, a proud badge that spoke of his far-reaching connections and the exotic nature of his goods. This wasn't mere imitation, it was a creative fusion, a visual testament to how economic necessity drove intercultural dialogue. This blending of motifs did more than just create pretty designs. It actively fueled economic growth by fostering mutual understanding, expanding markets, and introducing new products and aesthetic ideas that enriched European culture. This incredible interconnectedness, this dense and vibrant web of trust and trade that spanned continents, was the greatest strength of the medieval economy at its peak. It allowed for specialization on a grand scale, moved goods to where they were most valued, and circulated capital with breathtaking efficiency. But this very strength contained within it a hidden and profound vulnerability. The same networks that could spread wealth and innovation with lightning speed could also, with equal efficiency, spread disaster. A financial panic in Florence could now trigger bank failures in Bruges. A trade dispute with the Mamluks could strangle the spice supply to all of Europe. And most terrifyingly, a deadly disease festering in a distant Asian trading post could now find swift and direct passage aboard a merchant galley, sailing effortlessly along these same well-mapped routes of commerce, carrying with it the seeds of a catastrophe that would threaten to unravel everything this symbolic language had built. The very threads that wove this golden age together would soon begin to strain and then to snap. But this golden age of symbolic trust, for all its brilliance, carried within it the seeds of its own vulnerability. The very success of the merchant mark system began to work against it, creating a cascade of new problems that would slowly erode the foundations of this silent economy. As trade exploded and the number of merchants, craftsmen, and bankers swelled, so too did the number of unique symbols in use. What was once a relatively small and manageable visual lexicon, understood by a close-knit community, now became a crowded and chaotic alphabet. In bustling ports from London to Venice, thousands of distinct marks were now in circulation, carved on every surface, stamped on every document, and sewn into every bolt of cloth. This incredible proliferation led to an inevitable and damaging issue: symbolic saturation. With so many marks in use, it became nearly impossible to ensure that each one was truly unique. The simple geometric shapes that formed the core of this language, circles, squares, crosses, and lines, offered a limited pool of basic components. Merchants, often working in isolation in different cities, would independently arrive at strikingly similar designs. A cloth merchant in Ghent might design a mark that was, to his eyes, a unique representation of his family's initials. Yet, to a weary customs official in Antwerp, it could be virtually indistinguishable from the mark used by a leather worker in Cologne. This confusion wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it sparked bitter and costly disputes. Guild records from the 14th century are filled with lawsuits and arbitration cases centered on mark infringement. Two merchants would each claim rightful ownership of a nearly identical symbol, each arguing that their business and their hard-won reputation was being hijacked by the other. These legal battles drained resources, created animosity between trading partners, and introduced a new layer of uncertainty into transactions that were supposed to be built on absolute clarity. This climate of confusion created the perfect breeding ground for a far more sinister problem: outright fraud. The same universal recognition that made a respected mark so valuable also made it a tantalizing target for counterfeiters. An unscrupulous trader looking to make a quick profit didn't need to spend decades building a reputation for quality. He could simply copy the mark of a renowned master and apply it to his own inferior goods. The textile industry, one of the era's economic powerhouses, was particularly vulnerable to this kind of deception. A weaver producing cheap, coarse cloth could stamp it with a perfect imitation of a famous Flemish master's symbol and sell it for a premium price to an unsuspecting buyer hundreds of miles away. The fraud might not be discovered until the cloth was unpacked at its destination, by which time the counterfeiter had long since vanished with his profits. The consequences of this fraud were devastating and far-reaching. It wasn't just the individual master craftsman who suffered. The reputation of an entire city or region could be tarnished. There are documented cases where the prevalence of counterfeit marks on shoddy, Flemish cloth led to formal trade embargoes. Buyers in Italy or Germany, having been burned by bad products, would simply refuse to purchase any goods bearing marks from that entire region, punishing honest and dishonest merchants alike. This collective loss of trust was a poison in the well of commerce. The merchant's mark, once an ironclad guarantee, was becoming a questionable claim that required verification. The symbolic language was losing its power, its words becoming diluted and untrustworthy. Compounding this crisis was a broader atmosphere of economic pressure. The 14th century was a time of upheaval, marked by periods of rampant inflation, bank failures, and costly wars. For merchants struggling to survive in this volatile climate, the temptation to exploit their own hard-earned mark for short-term gain could be overwhelming. A respectable trader facing bankruptcy might make a desperate deal. He could allow a large quantity of substandard goods to be shipped under his trusted mark, collecting a hefty fee from the producer in exchange for the use of his reputation. In that one act, he would sacrifice a lifetime of built-up trust for a momentary cash infusion, devaluing not only his own symbol but contributing to the overall devaluation of the entire system of symbolic trust. These early warnings, these cracks appearing in the foundation, were subtle at first, but they signaled that the intricate and powerful network built on merchant marks was not invincible. It was a system facing immense stress, a silent language starting to falter, and it was about to be tested by a catastrophe unlike any the medieval world had ever seen. And then the world broke. The intricate and interconnected networks that merchant marks had so carefully mapped, the bustling trade routes, the complex credit arrangements, the silent agreements of trust were about to face a test of unimaginable ferocity. In the middle of the 14th century, a microscopic stowaway, Yersinia pestis, began traveling those same routes with a terrible efficiency, carried in the fleas on the backs of rats that scurried aboard the very merchant galleys that had been the engine of Europe's prosperity. The Black Death did not just kill people, it launched a direct assault on the foundations of the medieval economy itself, targeting the very concept of trust that merchant marks represented. The speed of the devastation was breathtaking. Between 1347 and 1351, the pandemic wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population. Ports fell silent. Major trading hubs like Venice and London became cities of the dead, their markets empty and their warehouses locked and abandoned. The trade routes that had been the lifeblood of the commercial revolution now became highways of death, and the movement of goods ground to a terrified halt. This sudden stop was catastrophic for the system of symbolic trust. A merchant's mark on a bill of exchange for a shipment of wool meant nothing if the merchant, the banker holding the debt, and the intended buyer were all dead. Those wax seals, once unbreakable guarantees, now sealed promises that could never be fulfilled. Archaeologists have found evidence of this collapse in the most poignant ways. Sellers in Hanseatic towns with goods still inside, their owner's mark carved by the door, a silent testament to a business and a life abruptly ended. Debt ledgers from Italian banks are filled with accounts suddenly gone cold, the elegant marks next to them now representing nothing but massive, unpayable losses that would contribute to the collapse of the great banking houses. The trust that had been built over generations evaporated in a matter of months, leaving behind a landscape of economic ruin. But from the ashes of this unimaginable trauma, a new economic world began to painfully emerge, and it was a world that fundamentally challenged the old order. The catastrophic loss of life created a severe labor shortage, a problem the feudal system was utterly unequipped to handle. Suddenly, the peasants and artisans who had survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Their labor was now a scarce and valuable commodity. They could, for the first time, demand higher wages for their work and better terms from their employers. Across Europe, governments panicked, passing laws like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force people to work for their old masters. But these laws were largely unenforceable. The economic reality was undeniable. The bargaining power had permanently shifted. This was a revolution as profound as any war, shattering the centuries-old feudal hierarchy and empowering a new class of mobile, wage-earning workers. The old markers of status, so carefully encoded in elaborate merchant marks, began to mean less than sheer practical skill and the ability to get a job done. This Great Reset had a dramatic and visible impact on the world of merchant marks themselves. Many symbols simply vanished forever. A meticulously designed heraldic mark that had represented a powerful trading family for 5 generations could disappear in a single terrible summer, its entire lineage wiped out. Their warehouses stood empty, their marks on legal documents now just curious artifacts for historians. But nature abhors a vacuum, and economics even more so. Into the spaces left by the dead rushed new entrants, opportunistic survivors, ambitious journeymen, and clever outsiders who had previously been locked out of the system. And they often did something fascinating. They repurposed old marks. A journeyman who took over his deceased master's workshop might continue using the well-respected mark, benefiting from its established reputation. Others would adapt the symbols, adding a new line or a slight modification to a familiar design, signaling a new chapter of ownership while still leveraging the residual trust of the old. The archaeological record shows this strange evolution, marks that are almost identical to pre-plague designs, but with a subtle twist, a quiet announcement that the world had changed and new people were now in charge. This period of chaos also forced a dramatic blurring of the lines between the formal, guild-controlled economy and the hidden, trust-based shadow economies. The old rules simply didn't apply anymore. With guilds decimated and enforcement capabilities weakened, trade became more fluid and less regulated out of sheer necessity. At the same time, the sheer trauma of the plague made people and governments deeply suspicious of the complex, far-flung networks that had once been a source of wealth. There was a collective turning inward, a desire for more local control and visible oversight. In response, nascent nation-states began to flex their muscles, stepping in to regulate trade more directly through royal charters, standardized national currencies, and centralized legal systems. They sought to bring the chaotic, shadowy world of trade into the light of government control, a process that would gradually make the personal, trust-based system of merchant marks seem antiquated. The plague had exposed the terrifying fragility of a world built on symbolic trust. It showed that even the most robust and sophisticated network could unravel in an instant when faced with an existential crisis. This collective loss of innocence, this understanding that a symbol was only as strong as the society that backed it, fundamentally changed how people thought about commerce and security, setting the stage for the slow but steady decline of the very symbolic language that had once made it all possible. Yet the world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was fundamentally different, and the very tools that had once rebuilt trust now seemed to belong to a fading age. As Europe staggered into the 16th century, a new set of forces began to rise, not from the ashes of disease, but from the ambitions of kings and the innovations of printers. The elegant, personal language of the merchant mark, which had once whispered promises of quality and credit across continents, began to be drowned out by the louder, more uniform voices of nation-states and formal institutions. This was not a sudden extinction, but a gradual fading, a slow turning of the page from a world built on personal reputation to one increasingly governed by impersonal systems. The most powerful of these new forces was the rising nation-state. Kings and queens, no longer content to be mere feudal overlords, began to consolidate their power, and a crucial part of that project was bringing the chaotic world of trade under their direct control. They did this by creating formal, standardized legal systems that replaced the need for personal symbolic trust. Why rely on the intricate mark of a generous banker to guarantee a loan when the English crown could issue a royal charter to a regulated company, granting it a legal monopoly over trade with a specific part of the world? These charters, like the one given to the East India Company, came with the full force of the state behind them. Your business was secure not because of your family's symbol, but because the king said it was. Similarly, the shift toward nationally standardized currencies, coins minted by a royal authority with a guaranteed weight and purity, began to erode the need for the complex credit networks that merchant marks had once secured. A gold crown was a gold crown, its value decreed by the monarch, not negotiated through the recognition of a personal symbol on a bill of exchange. The state was becoming the ultimate guarantor of economic truth, and its language was one of written law and stamped metal, not carved emblems. This bureaucratic revolution was supercharged by another technological leap, the printing press. While it had initially helped standardize marks, its ultimate effect was to make them less special. The press allowed for the mass production of detailed, uniform contracts. A merchant could now sit down with a pre-printed form, filling in the blanks with names, dates, and sums. The unique, wax-sealed mark authenticating the document became just one part of a much larger, text-heavy legal instrument. The contract itself, with its specific clauses and printed formalities, now carried the weight of the agreement. The symbol was being reduced from the central element of the deal to a mere signature at the bottom of the page, its power diluted by paragraphs of legalese. This shift toward textual literacy further marginalized the older, visual language of the marks, which had been so vital in a less literate world. At the same time, new forms of business organization were emerging that operated on a scale far beyond any individual merchant. The growth of centralized banking institutions and joint stock companies like the famous Dutch East India Company created entities that were abstract and corporate, not personal. You weren't investing in a particular merchant with a recognizable mark. You were buying a share in a vast, impersonal enterprise. The company's reputation was built on its financial reports and its royal privileges, not on the familial symbol of its founder. The guilds, which had been the great patrons and regulators of the mark system, also found their power waning in the face of these state-backed monopolies and the rising tide of capitalist competition. Their carefully maintained registers of approved marks began to look like relics from a bygone era of local control. Even the spiritual dimension of the marks, which had once provided a layer of divine insurance for medieval traders, was stripped away by the religious upheavals of the period. The Protestant Reformation and the brutal religious wars that followed shattered the universal Christian culture of Europe. A cross or a saint's emblem on a merchant's mark, which had once been a near universal signal of trustworthiness in a Catholic world, could now be viewed with suspicion or even hostility in Protestant regions. The shared spiritual language that had underpinned so many symbols lost its common meaning, further diminishing their cultural power and reducing them to purely practical and therefore less potent identifiers. And yet, to say the merchant mark vanished would be a profound mistake. It did not die, it evolved. It fragmented and specialized, finding new niches in the modernizing economy. The personal guarantee of quality transformed into the legally protected trademark, a symbol that denoted the origin of a product but was owned by a corporation, not a person. The need to guarantee the purity of precious metals gave rise to the continued use of hallmarks, still struck by assay officers today, a direct descendant of the Guild's quality control. And the basic psychological principle that a simple, recognizable visual symbol can convey a world of meaning about quality and origin, found its ultimate expression in the modern corporate logo. The swoosh on your sneakers, the apple on your laptop, the golden arches on the roadside, these are the heirs to the merchant mark. They are the language of symbolic trust, translated and scaled for a globalized mass market world. The hidden economies of personal trust had given way to the branded economies of corporate identity, proving that while the world changes, the human need for a visual shorthand for quality and reliability is truly timeless. But the very system of symbolic trust that had built the Hanseatic League's empire would ultimately contribute to its unraveling. For centuries, the shared merchant mark had been a powerful unifying force, a visual handshake between members from Lubeck to Novgorod. Yet, by the 16th century, that same symbol began to fracture under immense pressure. The rise of powerful, centralized nation-states like England, France, and Sweden created a new world order where national allegiance increasingly trumped Hanseatic loyalty. A merchant from Hamburg, for instance, might now find his commercial interests aligned more closely with the ambitions of a German prince than with his fellow Hanseatic traders in distant Riga. The League's collective strength, once its greatest asset, was now viewed with suspicion by kings who saw it as a rival power, an obstacle to their own economic control. These monarchs began granting preferential trade terms to their own national companies, deliberately bypassing the Hanseatic network and offering a more profitable path that didn't require sharing profits or adhering to the League's strict codes. Internally, the glue of trust was also failing. The proliferation of counterfeit Hanseatic marks became a rampant problem, a silent cancer eating away at the League's reputation. Unscrupulous traders, both inside and outside the network, began slapping imitation League symbols on substandard goods. A bundle of mediocre fur or a barrel of sour beer bearing a forged Hanseatic cog ship emblem could be sold at a premium price, but the buyer's disappointment would forever be associated with the League's once impeccable brand. This fraud created crippling distrust among members themselves. Bitter disputes erupted over the legitimate use of marks, with cities accusing each other of failing to police their own merchants or even of turning a blind eye to counterfeiting to gain a local advantage. The marks designed to prevent exactly this kind of confusion were now the source of endless litigation and bad blood, weakening the collective authority from within until the very concept of a shared Hanseatic identity began to feel like a quaint fantasy. Perhaps the most devastating blow, however, was a literal change in the currents of global commerce. For centuries, the Hanseatic League had dominated the Baltic and North Sea trade routes, its wealth built on the flow of goods between Eastern and Western Europe. But the 16th century's age of exploration irrevocably shifted the economic center of gravity. New sea routes discovered by Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English explorers now connected Europe directly to the immense wealth of the Americas and the Spice Islands of Asia. This was the birth of the Atlantic economy, and it deliberately bypassed the Hanseatic heartland. The great trading hubs of the future would be London, Amsterdam, and Seville ports facing the vast Atlantic, not the confined Baltic. The Hanseatic League, with its fleet of sturdy but slow cogs designed for coastal and river trade, was simply not built for these long, dangerous ocean voyages. Its symbols held no power in the markets of Goa or the Caribbean. The League was suddenly geographically and economically marginalized, watching from the sidelines as a new global economy emerged, one that had no need for its ancient symbols or its rigid rules. By the time the Hanseatic League held its final formal diet in 1669, its dissolution was less a dramatic collapse and more a quiet acknowledgement of a reality that had already taken hold. The mighty network had faded into irrelevance. The once prized marks that had guaranteed quality and commanded respect were now little more than historical curiosities, relics of a bygone era of merchant republics and guild power. They were still used locally, of course, but their international authority had vanished, their power drained away by the twin forces of nationalist ambition and global transformation. The story of the Hanseatic League's decline is a powerful lesson in the fragility of even the most robust symbolic systems. It shows that trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, and that no institution, no matter how powerful, can afford to stand still while the world moves around it. The League's failure to adapt its symbols and its structures to a changing world offers a timeless warning about the peril of clinging to the tools of the past, no matter how brilliantly they once served. But how do we know all of this? How can we be so sure about the intricate workings of these hidden economies that operated centuries ago, often deliberately leaving behind as little official trace as possible? The answer lies not in grand royal decrees or history books written by the powerful, but in the quiet, patient work of historians and archaeologists who have learned to read the silent language of the marks themselves. These symbols, carved into stone, pressed into wax, and scratched onto personal belongings, have survived the centuries, and they are now telling their stories to those who know how to listen. In cities that were once the epicenters of medieval trade, like Gdansk in Poland or Bruges in Belgium, the very walls whisper secrets to researchers. Archaeologists excavating ancient cellars used for storage have found merchant marks meticulously chiseled into the stone door frames or beside storage niches. This wasn't vandalism, it was a practical filing system. Each mark identified which merchant owned the goods stored within, transforming a communal space into a secure, organized warehouse. Similarly, fine silverware or personalized ceramic jugs often bear the engraved mark of their owner, a permanent claim of identity on a valuable object that might be used in a tavern or a wealthy household. These physical artifacts reveal patterns of ownership and trade that written documents, which often only recorded transactions for tax purposes, deliberately omitted. The detective work doesn't stop at the excavation site. Archivists poring over centuries-old church ledgers and notarial records have discovered that these documents are often peppered with merchant marks drawn in the margins or next to signatures. For a long time, these were seen as simple flourishes, but we now understand they served a critical function. In a partially literate society, a person's mark was their legal signature, a unique identifier that held the same weight as a written name. A notary recording a loan between two merchants would carefully draw their client's marks next to the sum, creating a visual record that was harder to forge than a name. Church ledgers, which recorded donations, payments for masses, and property bequests, also used these symbols to identify the families involved. By cross-referencing these marks across different types of records, a legal contract here, a burial record there, historians can start to reconstruct entire life histories of medieval traders who would otherwise be completely lost to time, tracing their business dealings, their family connections, and their rise or fall in fortune. The real revolution in understanding, however, has come from marrying this traditional scholarship with cutting-edge technology. Researchers are now using high-resolution 3D scanning to create perfect digital replicas of marks found on uneven surfaces, like worn stone or distorted wax seals. This allows for incredibly precise comparisons that the naked eye could never make, identifying the unique tool marks of a specific chisel or the minute imperfections in a particular seal matrix that prove authenticity. Furthermore, historians are building massive digital databases where they can catalog thousands of these scanned symbols. This lets them perform a kind of algorithmic detective work, tracking the movement of a single, unique mark across Europe and across decades. The database can instantly flag connections that would have taken a lifetime of research to uncover manually. Imagine the story that emerges when the exact same merchant mark is found stamped on a lead seal attached to a bale of raw English wool excavated in a Flemish port, and then again, just a few months later, drawn in the account books of an Italian banking house in Genoa next to a record of a loan repayment. This isn't a coincidence, it's a digital breadcrumb trail. It reveals a specific long-distance partnership that operated outside the official, guild-sanctioned channels. The English wool producer wasn't just selling to a local middleman. He had a direct financial relationship with an Italian banker, likely using the wool as collateral for a loan or as payment for a previous debt. This single connection, pulled from the silence of two unrelated artifacts, helps us map a hidden economy of finance and trade that bypassed all the official systems, a network built on personal trust and symbolized by that one recurring design. These findings are fundamentally challenging the traditional narratives of medieval economics, which relied heavily on formal records from kings and guilds. They are revealing a world that was far more dynamic, complex, and interconnected than we ever knew. A world where informal, trust-based systems were often the real engine of commerce, and their history is still there, waiting in the archives and etched in stone for anyone willing to learn its language. It might seem like a giant leap from a 14th century wool merchant's chalk mark to the glowing apple on the back of your smartphone, but the journey is a direct one. The core principles that made those medieval symbols so powerful, instant recognition, a promise of quality, and the encapsulation of trust, are the exact same forces that drive our modern visual landscape. We are still using that same ancient language of visual shorthand. We've just given it a new vocabulary for a digital age. Walk down any city street today, and you are surrounded by the direct descendants of the merchant mark. The Nike swoosh, the golden arches of McDonald's, the bitten apple of Apple Inc. These are not merely decorative logos, they are corporate coats of arms, functioning with the same efficiency as a Hanseatic trader's symbol on a barrel of fur. They convey a universe of information about quality, origin, and brand values in a fraction of a second, completely bypassing the need for words. This is the modern manifestation of that medieval need for a universal, trans-language system of trust. We don't need to read the word Nike to understand the association with athleticism and performance. The swoosh alone carries that meaning, much as a wave-like line on a medieval mark instantly communicated a connection to the sea and shipbuilding. This is the enduring legacy of the merchant mark, the understanding that in a crowded and often confusing marketplace, A simple, well-designed symbol is the most powerful currency of trust there is. This legacy extends far beyond consumer branding and into the very architecture of our digital security. The medieval merchant's fear that his unique mark could be copied by a counterfeiter to pass off shoddy goods is the same fundamental problem that digital security experts face today: how to verify identity and ensure authenticity in a realm of perfect duplication. The solutions we've engineered are astonishingly sophisticated, but the conceptual DNA can be traced back to those wax seals and carved signatures. The wax seal itself, with its unique impression that was difficult to forge without the original metal matrix, was an early form of cryptographic signature. It was a physical token that proved the document was authentic and had not been tampered with. Today, that concept lives on in digital signatures and blockchain technology. A modern digital signature is the cryptographic equivalent of a unique merchant mark combined with an unbreakable wax seal. It uses complex mathematics to create a verifiable and unforgeable proof of identity, an intent attached to an electronic document. It assures the recipient that the message came from the claimed sender and that it was not altered in transit, solving the age-old problem of trust between parties who cannot meet face-to-face. Blockchain technology takes this concept of distributed, symbolic trust to its logical extreme, creating a system that functions like a global, incorruptible, and permanent guild ledger. Remember how the Hanseatic League used a shared system of marks to create a trusted network. A blockchain is a decentralized digital version of that. It is a public ledger where transactions are recorded in a way that is transparent, verifiable by everyone on the network, and practically impossible to change retroactively. Each block of data is cryptographically linked to the one before it, creating a chain of trust that is maintained not by a central authority like a king or a guild, but by the consensus of the entire network. This creates a tamper-proof record of ownership and transaction history, whether for cryptocurrencies, digital contracts, or even the provenance of physical goods like diamonds or fine art. In essence, blockchain is building a new kind of hidden economy, a trustless trust system where the need for a central guarantor is replaced by cryptographic proof and collective verification, a direct, high-tech echo of the peer-to-peer trust that medieval merchants once placed in each other's symbols. This profound continuity, stretching from stone carvings to silicon chips, offers us a crucial perspective on our current economic and social debates. The challenges of globalization, the rise of digital hidden economies, and the constant struggle to establish trust between strangers online are not entirely new phenomena. They are simply the latest chapters in a very old story. The medieval merchants who grappled with language barriers, fluctuating currencies, and unreliable partners would instantly understand the core dilemmas faced by a freelance developer today seeking trusted clients on a global platform or a small business trying to prove its authenticity in a vast online marketplace. They pioneered the first systems of globalization, and their tools were symbols. By studying their successes and their failures, how their system thrived on open trust, but was eventually weakened by fraud and overwhelmed by larger, more centralized forces, we can better navigate our own rapidly evolving world. The medieval world teaches us that economies are ultimately built on human relationships and the symbols we use to represent them. Whether that symbol is a cross inside a circle stamped on a wax seal or a cryptographic key securing a digital transaction, the goal remains unchanged: to connect, to trade, and to build a network of trust that can span continents and centuries. The language has evolved, but the conversation is the same. What can these silent symbols from centuries past possibly teach us about our own hyper-connected digital world? The answer is quite simply everything. The rise and fall of the merchant mark economies offer a masterclass in the timeless principles that underpin all human exchange, revealing that trust, innovation, and resilience are not modern management buzzwords, but the very bedrock of survival and success. At its heart, the story of the merchant mark is a story about trust, that most fragile and essential of currencies. Medieval traders understood that trust is not an abstract concept. It is a tangible asset, painstakingly built through consistent action and then crystallized into a symbol. A mark on a barrel of wine was a promise kept, a debt honored, a quality guaranteed. This system worked because that trust had real, immediate consequences. Abuse it by selling poor goods under a trusted symbol, and your reputation, and by extension, your livelihood could vanish overnight. This historical mirror reflects a stark warning for our own era of online reviews and social media influencers. A 5-star rating on a platform or a respected brand name is our modern merchant mark. We rely on these aggregated symbols of trust every day, but as the medieval merchants discovered, these systems are incredibly vulnerable to the poison of fraud. A few fake reviews can destroy a small business. A single product recall can tarnish a global brand. The lesson is clear. Trust is the engine of any economy, but it is a renewable resource that requires constant, careful maintenance. Once depleted, it is agonizingly difficult to restore. Yet these medieval economies were not static. Their survival depended on a relentless spirit of innovation in the face of overwhelming challenges. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, it didn't just kill people, it shattered entire supply chains and obliterated established networks of credit. The response was not a passive acceptance of collapse. Instead, we see a remarkable story of adaptation in the archaeological record. Newcomers repurposed the marks of the dead, guilds relaxed their rigid rules to fill labor shortages, and trade routes were hastily redrawn to bypass plague-stricken regions. This wasn't just resilience, it was a radical, pragmatic innovation born of necessity. They were forced to reinvent their entire economic model overnight. This offers a powerful model for modern businesses navigating their own existential crises, whether it's a global pandemic, a disruptive new technology, or a sudden shift in market dynamics. The medieval response teaches us that the most successful entities are not necessarily the strongest, but the most adaptable, those willing to let old systems die and quickly build new ones from the ashes. Their innovation wasn't about inventing something entirely new, but about recombining existing tools like the merchant mark itself to serve a terrifying new world. This leads us to the most profound and enduring lesson, the astonishing resilience of informal, hidden economies. Throughout history, whenever formal structures, be they feudal lords, powerful guilds, or overreaching governments, have become too rigid, too corrupt, or simply too incompetent to meet human needs, people have instinctively built alternatives in the shadows. The merchant marks were the tools that made these shadow systems possible. They allowed Jewish bankers to create credit networks outside of restrictive Christian laws, enabled widows to keep their family businesses running despite guild rules barring them, and helped communities smuggle essential goods past brutal taxes during times of famine. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a testament to a fundamental human drive for self-preservation and community support. We see this same energy today in the rise of cryptocurrencies seeking to operate outside traditional banking systems, in the explosion of the gig economy that creates flexible work outside corporate structures, and in local community networks that organize aid when official disaster response fails. These are all modern hidden economies, powered not by carved symbols but by digital code and social media groups. Yet they are motivated by the very same impulse. when the official system breaks down or leaves people behind, human ingenuity will always find a way to build a new one. Ultimately, these silent witnesses from the past remind us that economies are not cold, mechanical systems of laws and currencies. They are deeply human creations woven together from stories and symbols. A medieval merchant's mark told a story of heritage, of craftsmanship, of a promise made. Our modern equivalents, a brand logo, a 5-star rating, a verified social media badge, are no different. They are vessels for the stories we tell each other about quality, reliability, and value. The great lesson from the rise and fall of these forgotten economies is that our financial systems are only as strong as the human relationships and shared trust that underpin them. Technology changes, symbols evolve, but the fundamental challenges remain. How do we build trust with strangers? How do we adapt when the world turns upside down? And how do we take care of each other when the structures above us fail? The answers are still being written, not in ledgers or lines of code, but in the daily choices we make to honor our promises and build communities of mutual support, just as those medieval traders did, one symbolic mark at a time. One of the most persistent myths about merchant marks is that they were simple, practical signatures, nothing more than a medieval barcode for claiming ownership. This view strips them of their profound cultural and personal significance. In reality, these symbols were deeply layered with meaning, often serving as a compact visual autobiography. A mark wasn't just an identifier, it was a carefully crafted emblem that could convey a merchant's family lineage, his religious faith, his professional trade, and his social aspirations all at once. A cross or a star might invoke divine protection for a dangerous sea voyage, while an intricate knot could symbolize the unbreakable bonds of a family business. These designs were thoughtful and intentional, blending spiritual beliefs with commercial ambition in a way that resonated deeply within a society where the sacred and the secular were intimately intertwined. To reduce them to mere practicality is to miss the rich tapestry of medieval thought they represent. Another common misconception is that this was exclusively a European Christian practice. Nothing could be further from the truth. The use of symbolic identifiers in trade was a global phenomenon. Muslim merchants across the Islamic world, from Al-Andalus in Spain to the ports of the Indian Ocean, employed their own distinct seals and marks, often incorporating elegant Arabic calligraphy and geometric patterns that complied with Islamic traditions, avoiding figurative imagery. These symbols facilitated trade along the Silk Road and beyond, connecting markets from Baghdad to Beijing. Jewish traders, often operating in diaspora communities across Europe and the Mediterranean, developed marks that seamlessly blended Hebrew characters with common geometric shapes, creating a dual-purpose symbol that built trust within their own community while remaining recognizable to outside partners. This system was a truly international language of commerce, adapted and adopted by diverse cultures who all faced the same fundamental challenge: how to build trust across distances without a common spoken tongue. The story of the merchant mark also doesn't end with the close of the medieval period, as if they were simply discarded with the arrival of the printing press and formal contracts. While their primary function evolved, their DNA is woven into the fabric of our modern economy. They didn't vanish, they transformed. The need to guarantee the purity of precious metals gave us the hallmarks still struck on silver and gold today. The desire to assert origin and quality evolved into our complex system of legally protected trademarks and corporate logos. Every time we recognize the swoosh on a pair of sneakers or the iconic fruit on a laptop, we are participating in a centuries-old tradition of symbolic trust that began with those marks carved into stone and pressed into wax. The medium has changed, but the psychological principle remains identical. A simple visual symbol can convey a world of meaning about quality, origin, and reputation in an instant. By clearing away these misconceptions, we gain a much clearer and more fascinating picture of the past. We see merchant marks not as quaint, primitive tools, but as a dynamic and adaptable system that was incredibly sophisticated for its time. This nuanced understanding is crucial because it prevents us from oversimplifying a complex historical phenomenon. It allows us to appreciate the full scope of their impact, revealing how these symbols facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but the exchange of ideas, the building of cross-cultural bridges, and the operation of intricate economic networks that operated with remarkable efficiency. When we recognize the depth and breadth of this system, we can finally see these forgotten symbols for what they truly were: the foundational architecture of the first global economy, a silent language that mapped the aspirations and connections of a world more complex and interconnected than we often imagine. While the merchant marks of Europe were weaving their intricate web of trust across the continent, a remarkably similar story was unfolding on the other side of the world, proving that the need for a silent commercial language was a universal human impulse. To believe this was solely a European phenomenon is to miss the bigger, far more fascinating picture. From the bustling ports of the South China Sea to the vast trade networks spanning the pre-colonial Americas, diverse cultures developed their own sophisticated systems of symbolic identification, often entirely independently, revealing a shared global ingenuity for solving the same fundamental problems of commerce. Consider the ancient Chinese tradition of the chop. Far more than a simple signature, a chop was a personalized seal, typically carved from stone, jade, or precious wood, and used with a distinctive red cinnabar paste. For over 3,000 years, these seals were the absolute cornerstone of legitimacy in China, used to authorize everything from imperial decrees and legal contracts to works of art and, crucially, commercial goods. A Chinese merchant shipping priceless blue and white porcelain to a buyer in Southeast Asia would carefully stamp the base of each piece or its wooden crate with his unique chop. This mark served multiple purposes at once. It identified the kiln or the merchant house responsible for the product, guaranteeing a certain level of craftsmanship and quality. It also acted as a claim of ownership and a promise of authenticity, making it an indispensable tool for managing the complex logistics of long-distance trade. When European traders from the Dutch and British East India Companies began arriving in the 16th century, they didn't try to impose their own system. They quickly adopted the use of chops themselves to participate effectively in the established Asian trade networks. They understood that the red symbol was the key that unlocked trust and acceptance in those markets, a direct parallel to how a foreign merchant would have used his own mark to gain entry into the Hanseatic League. Across the Islamic world, from the markets of Damascus to the trading posts of Zanzibar, a different but equally powerful tradition flourished. Islamic merchant seals often combined geometric patterns, a mainstay of Islamic art, with elegant Arabic calligraphy. Instead of depicting figurative images which were often discouraged, these seals might feature the name of the merchant or his company, the name of God Allah, or a brief pious invocation like, "In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful." This blend of commerce and faith was profound. A seal bearing the name of God was not just a business identifier, it was a sacred vow of honesty, a public declaration that the merchant's dealings were undertaken with piety and integrity. This spiritual dimension added a powerful layer of trust that transcended mere commercial interest. These seals were pressed into clay affixed to shipments of spices, ink on contracts for shipments of textiles, and stamped onto ledgers tracking the movement of goods along the Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade routes. They facilitated a vast economic sphere that connected the Mediterranean to the Spice Islands, operating on a principle of trust that was both personal and deeply religious. In the Americas, long before European contact, indigenous nations had developed their own non-verbal systems for communicating value and origin. While not identical to the personalized marks of Eurasian merchants, these systems served the same essential economic functions within vast inter-tribal trade networks. For instance, tribes in the Pacific Northwest engaging in the potlatch system, a complex ceremony involving the redistribution of wealth, would use specific, culturally understood pictographs painted on hides or carved into posts to denote the value and provenance of goods. A skilled artisan might use a unique family or clan symbol on a finely woven basket or a carved copper shield, signaling its quality and origin to potential trading partners from other nations. Further east, among the powerful Haudenosaunee-Iroquois Confederacy, wampum belts made of intricately woven shell beads were not merely currency, they were a form of record-keeping and contractual agreement. The specific patterns and symbols woven into a belt could ratify a treaty, record a trade agreement, or signify an important historical event, creating a binding, visual record of an economic or diplomatic promise that could be understood across linguistic barriers. When we place these systems side by side, a stunning pattern of convergent evolution emerges. Cultures separated by immense oceans and millennia of independent development all arrived at the same brilliant solution, a trusted, repeatable symbol to mitigate risk and build commercial trust. The Chinese chop, the Islamic seal, the European merchant mark, and the indigenous pictograph all serve to answer the same critical questions for a potential buyer. Who made this? Where does it come from? Can I trust its quality? The universal adoption of this strategy highlights a fundamental truth about human economics. In the absence of a common language or an overarching legal authority, we will instinctively create visual systems to facilitate exchange and build community. Yet within this universality, the cultural differences are equally revealing. The European marks often emphasized individual or family identity through heraldic-like designs. The Chinese system was deeply integrated into a bureaucratic and artistic tradition. The Islamic seals infused commerce with a profound spiritual commitment. And indigenous systems often embedded economic information within a larger framework of cultural storytelling and communal agreement. This beautiful diversity shows us that while the problem of trust in trade is a human constant, the solutions are wonderfully varied, each reflecting the unique values and aesthetics of the culture that created them. This global perspective shatters any remaining Eurocentric view of economic history, revealing a world intricately connected not by a single system, but by a shared, brilliant human instinct to communicate, trade, and trust through the power of the symbol. Yet for all their power to connect and build trust, these symbols also cast a long and often dark shadow. The very same marks that could empower a small craftsman or a savvy widow were also potent tools for reinforcing rigid power structures, systematically excluding outsiders, and enabling some of history's most brutal forms of exploitation. This visual language of commerce was never neutral. It was a mirror reflecting the full spectrum of human ambition, including our deepest flaws and capacities for cruelty. To truly understand merchant marks, we must confront this uncomfortable duality, the fact that a symbol of trust for one person could represent oppression and exclusion for another. Consider the marks used by the great colonial trading companies of the 16th and 17th centuries, like the Dutch East India Company or the British Royal African Company. Their corporate symbols, elaborate crests featuring lions, ships, and globes were stamped, burned, and branded onto a horrifying range of commodities. These marks were imprinted on barrels of sugar harvested by enslaved people in the Caribbean, on bales of cotton picked by forced labor in the American South, and even in the most dehumanizing act, directly onto the skin of enslaved Africans themselves. In these contexts, the merchant mark transformed completely. It shed any pretense of mutual trust or quality assurance. Instead, it became a stark, unambiguous symbol of ownership, coercion, and violent extraction. The mark no longer said, "I made this with pride." It declared, "I own this, and I own the people who produced it." This perversion of the symbol's original purpose reveals how a tool designed for building economic bridges could be weaponized to enforce a system of brutal subjugation and racialized capitalism that generated immense wealth for a few at an almost unimaginable human cost. The mark in these instances was not a signature of craftsmanship but a brand of conquest. Closer to home in Europe's medieval cities, the guild system itself, for all its benefits, often used merchant marks as instruments of control to maintain monopolies and suppress economic mobility. While guilds promised quality control and mutual aid for their members, they were also deeply conservative institutions obsessed with protecting their privileges. A master's mark was not just a badge of quality, it was a license to trade, a key to the city's economic inner circle. Guilds wielded the registration and regulation of these marks to ruthlessly enforce their boundaries. They could refuse to register the mark of an aspiring craftsman from the wrong family or the wrong religion, effectively barring him from selling his wares in the official market. They used mark infringement lawsuits not only to fight genuine counterfeiting, but also to harass and bankrupt independent artisans operating outside their control, those they dismissively called interlopers or cottagers who dared to produce goods without guild authorization. In this way, the system of marks intended to guarantee quality was twisted into a mechanism for gatekeeping, limiting competition, and ensuring that economic power and artisanal knowledge remained concentrated in the hands of a small, self-selecting group of established families. It was a way of legally enforcing a closed shop, perpetuating inequality by making it incredibly difficult for newcomers, no matter how skilled, to break into the market and rise economically. This critical perspective is essential. It prevents us from romanticizing the past and allows us to see merchant marks for what they truly were, incredibly adaptable tools. Their moral value depended entirely on the hands that wielded them. In the hands of a Jewish merchant in medieval Spain, a mark could be a key to economic survival and community solidarity in the face of persecution. That same type of symbol, in the hands of a colonial factor overseeing a plantation, became an instrument of oppression. The mark itself held no inherent morality. It amplified the intentions of its user for good or for ill. It could be a tool for building transparent, trust-based networks that uplifted entire communities, or it could be a weapon for consolidating power, exploiting the vulnerable, and creating exclusive clubs of privilege. By acknowledging this full, complex history, we gain a far more valuable and human lesson. We learn that no system of trust, not medieval marks, not modern trademarks, not digital ratings, is ever immune to being co-opted by the powerful for selfish ends. The challenge then and now is to vigilantly guard against this corruption, to ensure that the symbols of our economy serve to empower the many, not just to enrich and protect the few. This honest reckoning with the past is not an indictment of the merchant mark, but a necessary step in understanding the profound and double-edged relationship between symbols, power, and economics that continues to shape our world today. Just when it seemed the language of merchant marks had faded into the pages of history books, a fascinating revival is underway, breathing new life into these ancient symbols. This isn't a nostalgic look backward, but a forward-thinking movement where historians, artists, and innovative entrepreneurs are rediscovering the profound power these emblems hold for our modern world. Museums worldwide have become central to this awakening, curating stunning exhibitions that transform these practical symbols into objects of art and intrigue. Visitors can now walk through galleries filled with enlarged, dramatic prints of medieval marks, their intricate lines and curves displayed like abstract masterpieces, while interactive screens allow people to design their own symbols based on historical principles. These exhibitions do more than display artifacts. They tell the human stories behind the marks, connecting us to the individual craftsmen and merchants who once used these designs to build their livelihoods and reputations centuries ago. This cultural rediscovery has sparked a parallel commercial renaissance, particularly among craft producers and ethical brands seeking to stand apart in an age of mass production and digital anonymity. Across Europe, traditional breweries have led this charge, researching and readopting historical marks from their local archives to stamp on their bottles and barrels. A small family-run brewery in Belgium might use a mark that originally belonged to a 15th-century brewmaster from their very town, creating a powerful link between past and present that signals unparalleled craftsmanship and local authenticity. Similarly, artisans working in leather, glass, and textiles are incorporating these historical symbols into their branding, not as mere decoration but as a genuine promise of quality. When you buy a handcrafted bag bearing a resurrected medieval mark, you're not just purchasing a product, you're participating in a centuries-old tradition of quality and personal accountability. This movement represents a quiet rebellion against the disposable culture of fast fashion and impersonal big-box stores, offering consumers a tangible connection to the human hands and stories behind what they buy. The driving force behind this revival seems to be a deep, collective yearning for what these symbols fundamentally represent: trust, transparency, and traceability. In our digital age, where transactions are faceless and supply chains are often opaque and complex, the simple, tangible promise of a merchant mark holds incredible appeal. It cuts through the noise of empty marketing slogans and offers something genuine and verifiable. This desire for authenticity has even reached the corporate world, where some forward-thinking companies are looking to these historical models as inspiration for building more ethical and transparent business practices. They're recognizing that the medieval system of symbolic trust, where your reputation was your most valuable asset and was literally stamped on every product you sold, offers a powerful alternative to the anonymous, often exploitative models of modern global capitalism. This isn't about recreating the past, but about learning from its wisdom to build a more humane economic future. Academic research has been the engine of this revival, with groundbreaking digital humanities projects bringing these ancient symbols to a global audience. Universities and cultural institutions are collaborating on ambitious initiatives to photograph, scan, and catalog thousands of merchant marks from archives, ledgers, and physical objects across continents. These aren't simple databases, they're sophisticated digital platforms that use pattern recognition software to track the migration of specific symbols across time and space, allowing researchers to map trade routes and economic connections with astonishing precision. What was once a painstaking process of physical travel and manual comparison can now be done by anyone with an internet connection, democratizing access to this hidden history. High school students can now explore these digital archives, while documentary filmmakers use the data to visualize medieval trade networks in stunning detail. This academic work has transformed merchant marks from obscure scholarly interest into a vibrant, accessible part of our shared cultural heritage, proving that these silent symbols still have much to teach us about innovation, community, and the enduring human need for connection in commerce. Now, let's put all of this into practice. I want you to try your hand at being a historical detective. Picture a symbol carved into the wooden beam of a 14th century warehouse in a port like Hamburg. It's a composite mark, but it's built from elements historians find again and again. At its heart is a sturdy circle representing unity and a complete, trustworthy business. Shooting up from the top of this circle is a single, straight vertical line, like a mast rising from the deck of a ship. This could signify aspiration, a connection to the divine, or perhaps a desire for their business to rise above all others. Now, crossing through the center of the circle is a horizontal line creating a simple cross. In the context of Northern European trade, this is almost certainly a declaration of Christian faith, a subtle signal to potential partners that this merchant was a God-fearing man whose word could be trusted because it was given in the sight of God. But look closer at the ends of this crossbar. Instead of being straight, they curl outward into two distinct, graceful spirals. These aren't just decorative flourishes. To a merchant from the Hanseatic world, these spiral ends might instantly evoke the scrollwork commonly found in Germanic design, subtly pointing to the owner's regional origins. But could they also represent something more? In a maritime city, those spirals could be interpreted as stylized waves or even ropes, suggesting a business deeply connected to the sea. Perhaps this merchant dealt in ship supplies, imported rope, or even funded trading voyages. Now, let's add one final, crucial layer: context. We found this mark not on a document in a church archive, but carved into the wood of a warehouse located just a few streets back from the docks. This physical location screams practical commerce, not just spiritual declaration. The combination of the cross, the maritime-inspired spirals, and the warehouse setting paints a vivid picture. This likely belonged to a successful, pious merchant whose business was built on the sea trade, someone who wanted to assure his partners that his dealings were both prosperous and honorable. That cross wasn't just about faith. It was a calculated business asset in a world where a handshake was sealed with a prayer. What do you think when you see this symbol now? Does it feel more like a random scratch or a carefully crafted resume? This is the exact puzzle historians face every day. They have to ask not just what the elements are, but what they meant to the people who used them. Would this mark have fostered trust? Absolutely. It communicated stability, faith, and a specific trade connection all at a glance. Could it have signaled danger? Perhaps to a competitor or to someone outside the accepted faith, it might have been a subtle warning that this was a closed, protected network. The true story of any merchant mark is never just in its lines and curves, but in the silent conversation it started between the person who made it and the person who saw it. A conversation we are only just now beginning to overhear. So we've traveled a long road together, from the bustling docks of medieval Venice to the digital ledgers of our own time, tracing the incredible journey of a silent language that once powered the world. We saw how simple, personal symbols carved into stone or pressed into wax grew into a sophisticated engine of trust, enabling hidden economies to flourish in the shadows of kings and guilds. These marks mapped everything: the soaring ambitions of a merchant family, the powerful alliances between trading partners separated by continents, and the heartbreaking vulnerabilities of a system that, for all its ingenuity, could not withstand the Black Death or the rising tide of nation-states. They were more than signatures. They were the living pulse of commerce, a visual heartbeat that showed where wealth was flowing, where trust was strong, and where entire networks were on the brink of collapse. The great lesson echoing from these silent witnesses is that economies are never just about money and goods. They are built on something far more profound and far more human: a shared belief in a promise. A merchant's mark was a story etched in lines and curves, a story about quality, about heritage, about a deal that would be honored. It proves that the deepest foundations of trade are not gold or silver, but symbols and the stories we attach to them, stories that have the power to bind complete strangers together across unimaginable distances. This medieval system shows us the timeless human impulse to create order and trust where formal structures fail, to build systems of mutual support that operate just beyond the reach of official control, whether that's a 14th century smuggler's route or a 21st century blockchain. And that is perhaps the most enduring wisdom these forgotten symbols offer us today. As we navigate our own economic revolutions, the dizzying rise of digital currencies, the complex ethics of global supply chains, the quest for authenticity in a world of mass production, we are facing the same core challenges those medieval traders did. How do we build trust with people we cannot see? How do we adapt when a pandemic or a technological shift turns our world upside down? How do we maintain our humanity and our ethics within vast, impersonal systems? The answer isn't to look for a medieval solution, but to embrace the medieval spirit of resilience, innovation, and community. They teach us that when old systems crumble, we find a way to build new ones. When language fails, we create new ways to communicate. When trust is broken, we find a way to repair it, one honest transaction at a time. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the silent cartography of history. If you enjoyed Decoding the Past, feel free to like this video and subscribe for more adventures where we unravel the hidden stories that shaped our world. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What are the modern merchant marks? What symbols in our digital age do you think future historians will point to as the defining signatures of trust and value in our own hidden economy?